So before I start the lecture for week 3, just wanted to go over what we'll be covering, the agenda for this week. That includes an overview and summary of chapter 4, some questions for contemplation for the chapter, and again, as I indicate in the lecture, no need to submit these, but you'll find them useful if you're able to answer these questions in understanding the chapter, and also for your quiz that's coming up. We'll do an overview and summary of chapter 5, and similarly we'll have some questions for contemplation based on the chapter, and both chapters are from the Crosson Tower text. We'll do about the impact of violence and addiction on children, that talks about children against the backdrop of war and addressing the needs of military families. Now, as I think I've mentioned, the beautiful part of this text is the sections by Crosson Tower. So in chapter 4, the section summaries, chapter 5, the section summaries are on page 111, 114, 123, and 126. And then the overall summary can be found on page 126 and 127. Now, during the lecture, I mentioned the location for the summary of chapter 4, and also gave that to you previously last week, but you will get the page numbers for the section summary, and enjoy. So this lecture is based on the reading for week 3, which is based on chapter 4 and 5 from the Crosson Tower text. I did in my previous notes from week 2 share with you last time some of the overview of chapter 4. We'll go into it with a little more depth here, and we'll also cover chapter 5, and this will be the lecture for this class session. And chapter 4 talks about the impact of violence and addiction on children. So from week 3, I did mention in week 3 that chapter 4, as Crosson Tower does in the rest of this text, has the sectional summaries available on page 94, 97, 103, and 107, and that she has the overall summary on page 108. I do encourage you to follow those discussions, because you'll find them very useful. The text talks about the fact that our children are exposed to violence on a daily basis, and describes it as war in the street based on the influence of that has influence on youth violence. Concern is expressed over the promotion of violence in the media, and the question asked, why does television violence promote violence in the society, whether or not that is real? And she argues that some experts blame today's sport for the increase in violence among young people, and talk about enculturated aggression. The issue of violence and gangs Crosson Tower argues in chapter 4 that one manifestation of violence is that we have gang becoming a significant problem. And so experts have broken down these gangs into multiple categories, with each gang operating with some specific purpose that varies in degrees of cohesion, organization, orientation, and, as she argued, around specific crime agenda. So Crosson Tower does um, suggest that gangs vary in criteria for identity or association, and that gang offer youth a sense of belonging, feeling a purpose, and often the thrill of risk taking. And we talked about that last week. So we're not going to spend much time in this session, but she did argue that gang may migrate to find new markets. Many similarities and differences exist between male and female gangs. Crosson Tower also argues that schools are now marred by violent incidents, notably a rise in school shooting. And we did have some discussion about that as to the extent that that is real or perceived. Bullying is another issue that was mentioned, that it has become pronounced as a source of aggression and as a means for youth to demonstrate their power. And she argues that youth fall prey to the proliferation of aggression through social media and cyberbullying. I did make the point that we have cyber bullying going on even at the highest level, with even the President of the United States taking to Twitter to attack people he regards as his enemies, to talk about politicians, and just talk about people in general in ways that is deemed cyberbullying. The text makes the point that domestic violence, and specifically battering, in turn affect the children by making them fearful and guilty, as well as causing them to repeat the cycle of abuse. Crosson Tower, in discussing violence in the community, talk about the gangs on the street, the types, the defining gangs, talk about gang identified territory, permanence, some of the criminal activities, gang migration, and the role of girls in gangs. In this further discussion, she talks about school violence and bullying, and she talks about the fact that bullying, the intent is to harm, the repetitive use of it, and talk about the difference in physical or social power between victim and bully, and also discusses types of bullying and the effects that bullying has on a victim, that it can be multifold. And as mentioned previously, in the previous slide, she talks about domestic violence and violence within families where spouses abuse have been tolerated for years, where men batter their wives for a variety of reasons, and where children might identify with the aggressor. They might even blame themselves for issues of violence in the family. Crosson Tower also talks about the challenge in peer relationship, issue of data rape, substance abuse, and physical abuse, and talks about the correlation between violence and substance abuse. Essay here is for substance abuse. She talks about substance abuse in parents and addicted parents coming from all socioeconomic levels, not just the poor or the rich or the middle class. She talks about FAS and talk about the effects of parental drug on alcohol addiction and infants. And we did spend some time in class speaking to that issue. The text in this chapter also talks about the addicted parent and preschool children, addicted parent and older children, as well as practicing alcoholic and addicted parents syndrome, and children of addicted parents and the AIDS epidemic. Again, we did mention in class the issue of fetal alcohol syndrome. We talk about the effects of parental drug and alcohol addiction on infants. We talk about the politics of talking about crack babies and how different users are treated. Some are criminalized while some are seen as having the need for treatment. The chapter also talks about children and their parents regarding the effects in later life of having substance abusing parent and addicted children and adolescents, and some of the effects of the treatment of adolescent drug abuse. And some of these would include things like drug treatment, detox, and maintenance. So in essence, what we're saying is that the treatment is on a continuum, and this continuum is from no drug at all to some kind of maintenance where people are allowed to like use and reduce, and then detox where people might go into a facility and give them a substitute to address the drug issue. She also talks about some of the trends, the trend towards use at younger age, to the use of designer street drugs, and also discusses some of the causes of chemical dependence. The chapter, and we're still on chapter 4, talks about some of the effects and the treatment of adolescent drug abuse, with mention of multifunctional impact. And the types of treatment would include, again, what we've mentioned before: drug treatment, detox, and maintenance. So in summary, the text talks about the fact that daily we are reminded of the problems that face our children and youth, that violence is everywhere, in the home, in the school, on a playground, that substance abuse is a great challenge for young people, for children, and that chemical dependence among children is a serious challenge. So what I'm going to do at the end of this chapter is provide you with some questions that I would encourage you to look at these questions to look at these questions, and there's no requirement that you turn in any answer. There's nothing to submit, but this might be a way to help you understand the chapter better and the material that's in there, because if you are able to answer some of these questions, and since you know, you can try your answer, go back, examine just to see how much you get it. So here are a list of the questions that I'll recommend that you explore to get a better grip on the chapter itself. In what ways are today children exposed to violence? List the example found in the text. What are the effects of these exposure? Expand upon the text by imagining possible outcome of being exposed to violence. And the last question I hear: what can be done to put an end to the cycle of violence? Again, there's no requirement that you do this. There's no requirement that you submit this. But this is a good way for you to test yourself to see how much you understand the chapter. And you can guarantee that some of the questions that you'll get on the quiz if you're able to answer questions like these, then you'll have a good sense of the information contained in the chapter. So we're going to move on to chapter 5, and chapter 5 talks about the addressing the needs of military families. So it's children against the backdrop of war, addressing the needs of military families. And this is a new area that's being explored in child welfare services as more and more families are involved in military services. It has become abundantly clear that it is necessary to have background information, to have training, to have experience, to have expertise in working with military families because of the high percentage that they constitute of all families. A high percentage of kids come into our schools have one or two parents in the military, sometimes both of them deployed at the same time. So the need to address military children and military families is becoming more critical when we think of child welfare services. And Crosson Tower argued that this has become especially so since September 11. We just had an anniversary, the 16th anniversary of September 11 yesterday, with the various remembrance and memorials. So as the text point out, there are more than 2 million U.S. troops that have been deployed since 9/11 in support of the various military activities that include Operation Freedom, Iraqi Freedom, and Operation Enduring Freedom. And an important part of this is that the military is voluntary, and so civilian child welfare workers are definitely a critical part of this equation. The text talks about the military culture as it impacts the military family and identifies some of the reasons for enlistment. And those include family tradition, the benefits, both financial, education and training, and even the opportunity for future education. A lot of vets that we get in class will quickly point out that they went in the military primarily for the educational benefits. Some of the things that are mentioned, including as it impacts military family belonging to the warrior society, the authoritarian structure, the isolation and alienation, life on the bases, the distinct class system, sense of mission, the preparedness for disaster and death, and that military families have often left their extended family roots and are expected to thrive under these kinds of circumstances. So the types of military families mentioned include military men, deployment, military women, dual military couples, family care plan, and families of the National Guard and Reserves. And I mentioned just a minute ago the reality that some children have a parent or both parents who are in the military and might have one or both parents deployed at any given time. So some of the issues facing the children of military families would include living with changes, things like frequent moves, the effects of deployment and return, the impact on development. Sometimes parents that are deployed miss significant milestones for children, birthdays, important games, just critical things. Then the issue of spillover violence that manifests itself in family violence sometimes. Financial concern, always like a critical issue. Then other things would include taking a strengths-based approach to working with these families. So there's the encouragement to foster resilience, to become more familiar with the military culture and jargon, to assess and understand the origin of one's own attitude and prejudices towards these families, to consider how you personally feel about the issues of war and the military and service, and then to consider your concept of death and what that means to you. So when we talk about strengths-based approach working with military families, um, it is to become more aware um, of some of the issues that affect these families and to actively develop and practice sensitive strategies, and also to consider how you can create a safe environment. And as the picture here depicts, think of solutions and focus less on problems. It's just a kind of strengths-based approach to take when thinking about these kind of families. So in sum of chapter 5, the picture of the military and those who serve has changed over the last few years. Today's service members tend to be younger. They're volunteers who may have younger families, and the type of warfare for which they're exposed and the fact that they may be faced with multiple deployment impact family as well. It's also important to, as Crosson Tower points out, that increasing military families are seen by civilian counselors and social workers who must be prepared to work with them. And as Crosson Tower points out, a knowledge of military jargon is essential. She also talks about the fact that the civilian counselor must understand the vernacular, such as the implication of rank and why people join the military and the values held by the so-called warrior society. The issues faced by families may differ depending upon who is in the service, who is the service member, and whether they are full-time or whether they join the National Guard, or the reserves initially. The text also points out that children face a variety of issues as members of military family, that they must help to live with change as their families move from one place to another, and that deployment significantly affects children not only when a parent is physically away, but when the parent returns as well. And that multiple deployment of a parent or parents must invariably disrupt a child's life. The children's ability to learn and attend school can be impacted by what is happening to their military family. And as recent studies have uncovered, adjustment problem in both children and teen as they seek to cope with military life. And it's important to remember that there's always some kind of spillover of violence for those who have been involved in combat that impacts the lives of their children, their spouses, and other family members. And that domestic violence, substance abuse, and combat-related injuries, physical or emotional, affect how children and families relate. And in addition, there are serious financial worries that can increase family stress. So despite the issue that they face, military families often develop strengths that should be recognized and assessed by their helpers. And, specifically civilian social workers must strive to understand these families, certainly while attending to their own attitude and preconception about being in the military, about war itself, about deployment, those kinds of issues. Crosson Tower also makes the important point that the picture of the military and those who serve has changed in the last few years. So today's service members, and we have said this, tend to be younger, that they volunteer and they have younger families. The type of fear that they deal with might involve multiple deployment, and that also impacts the family. And with that said, I think I will move forward to the list of questions that I want you to think about for chapter 5. And again, there's no requirement to turn in these questions, but grappling with these questions might go a far way in helping you to understand the chapter, and also to address and deal with deal with some of the questions that might appear on the quizzes. Again, here are the questions based on chapter 5 that ask, for example, if you know anybody who has served in the military who has been deployed and returned home. What are some of the emotional challenges faced by military spouses? What is the role of the social worker in supporting them when they face these issues? Again, no requirement to submit or turn in these questions, but would encourage you to think about these questions as a way of understanding the chapter better. With that said, that's your summary of chapters 4 and 5 for week 3 when we do not meet face to face.